Okay, good to see that we've got everyone here. I think we're expecting about 50 people. We're up to about 40 now. I'm sure people will come on as we move along. So hi again, it's Dan Sandink here. I'm Director of Research with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. I'm co-host of the IBWG with Chad Nelson from Infrastructure Canada. Well, I'll pass it over to you shortly for introductory remarks. And of course, thanks to Anna Murphy for all of her coordination work behind the scenes. We've got a really great session today. I think you'll find it really valuable. Just a couple of logistical things before we get started. Keep yourself muted as we move along, but do unmute. Feel free during question periods to unmute yourself and chime in with questions. Also, enter questions throughout, comments, questions in the chat box throughout the session, and we'll make sure that we get to those during the question period. If you like right now, you can switch on your camera. We can see who's on the line, but it's up to you whether you keep the camera on throughout the meeting. Hi, everyone, good to see folks. The meeting is being recorded, and as usual, we'll record the meeting and post on an unlisted YouTube site, and we'll share the YouTube link when we send the notes around in a few days after the meeting. And I'd like to say thank you very much to all our new attendees. We've got a lot of new attendees, lots of new names on our list, and that's fantastic. We want, as much as possible, to have as many people as we can on these meetings. We can increase our Zoom attendance limit as necessary if people like to join. But if you have colleagues, associates that would like to join these meetings, feel free to send the invite along. And also feel free to reach out to Chad, Anna, or myself at any time if you have a presentation that you'd like to give to this crowd. If you have topics that you'd like covered, typically it's Anna, Chad, and I that are figuring out topics that we'd like to bring this audience. But this is an open working group, and we'd like to hear from you if you do have topics that you'd like covered or new projects that you'd like to present to this group. Also, and I mentioned use the chat as much as you like. One of the things that we encourage you to do is if you have a new project, a new report, a workshop coming up, a conference, copy and paste the information into the chat, and we will include that in the notes after the meeting. So this is a good opportunity to get your projects out to a pretty broad audience. We also have a membership directory that we are trying to fill out, and this we will eventually lead to a public directory of members of the IBWG with your name, your affiliation, your areas of work, pardon me, your interests. And we like to make that a public resource and a method for better networking and so on in the adaptation community. Let's make sure I didn't miss anything here. One last thing is, if you are interested in the buildings sector, and if you're involved in buildings, engineered buildings, otherwise, there is a deadline for submitting comments on the upcoming Canadian national model construction codes, including the National Building Code and so on. We'll put a link in the chat, but if you're working in the building sector, if you have thoughts and ideas about incorporating climate change adaptation, which is a policy directive for the 2030 building codes, those discussions are going to be happening over the next 5 years. And this is an opportunity for this community to have a voice in what goes into the next editions of the National Building Code. So we'll put a link in the chat. And also I'd say feel free to reach out to me or others on the line if you have questions about how to interact with that process. It's a little bit technical, but we can help you if you have an interest, and that's in incorporating climate adaptation into building construction going forward in Canada. With that, I think I've covered everything, and I'm going to pass it over to my co-chair, Chad.
Thank you, Dan. That's great. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here with us at the 41st call of the Infrastructure and Buildings Working Group that takes place underneath the auspices of the National Adaptation Platform, led out of Natural Resources Canada. And the topic of today's meeting is flooding and housing, and exploring what should be considered when building climate resilient communities in the face of this hazard. This logically follows on some of our recent calls about wildfires, and I hope you'll find this call as timely as we do, as we look to address Canada's current housing crisis while facing a future of climate uncertainty. Between 2019 and 2024, I've read that the cost of home and mortgage insurance across Canada rose about 28%, with severe weather as one of several driving factors. And today, we understand that approximately 10% of Canada's housing could be uninsurable for overland flooding, and about 80% of major Canadian cities are located wholly or in part in flood zones, as cited in an INTACT report, the Flood Rise Checkup. The INTACT Center for Climate Adaptation also recently released a tool that could be of interest to people on this call to support municipal adaptation, named the Municipal Flood Risk Checkup. And it's a self-assessment questionnaire containing 50 questions designed to assess your exposure to flood and implementation of actions to reduce flood risks. So Anna will paste that kindly in the chat, and you can see more information about it there. But also, as noted in a recent article from Civic Good, which was written by one of today's speakers, Don Iveson, our current housing crisis is a wicked problem that intersects with affordability, immigration, skilled labor, energy, and climate. And building climate resilient housing that is energy efficient, has lower GHG emissions, and is situated out of harm's way is imperative to sustainably addressing the housing crisis. So I hope you're as excited as I am to hear today from our presenters and the subsequent discussion amongst our membership to share knowledge, ideas on how different sectors and levels of government can coordinate to meet this challenge together. What can we do better independently? What can we do better together? I'll now turn to our first presenter. So we'll begin with Tamsin Lyle, the principal of Ebwater Consulting, who will explore challenges and opportunities that we face when building sustainable communities in a changing climate. And after a brief question period, we'll then move on to Don Iveson, the co-chair of the Task Force for Housing and Climate, to introduce the role of climate resilience within the Task Force Blueprint for Better Housing report. Following a brief discussion period, we'll have then some time to dedicate to roundtable updates before our concluding remarks. So I'd also encourage you to please make note of anything that comes to mind so that you can share it later. And the chat is always open, as Dan had said. So for our first speaker, without further ado, I'll just introduce that Tamsin Lyle is, as I said, the principal and founding engineer of Ebwater Consulting and a well-known thought leader on flood management in Canada. She's invested her academic and professional careers in the exploration of various aspects of floods and other climate hazards. And she's particularly interested in exploring the nexus of science, engineering, policy, and planning, disciplines that often work apart when best practice suggests they should work together. With that, I really hope I was not on mute. This is being recorded. Great. So we'll turn over now to Tamsin. Thank you.
Not on mute. Thanks, Chad. Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. So as Chad said, my name is Tamsin, founding engineer with Ebwater Consulting here on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations out in Vancouver. And I'm going to take you on a little bit of an adventure today, thinking about how we need to balance our present day housing needs with the potential failure of that housing going forward as we face more natural hazards and climate risks into the future. And I wanted to start our adventure today by highlighting, this was a new fact to me yesterday, I might be a just-in-time presenter here, that our housing, it was a disaster that created Canada's first housing policy in 1917. So the Halifax explosion, as anyone who watched those Heritage Minutes as a child would know, involved the razing of a large part of Halifax, necessitating a policy and plan in place to support the redevelopment of that area, and ultimately Canada's first housing policy. So I think that really, to me, strikes a chord because it describes how intricately these things are tied together, disaster and housing. And I'm going to take you on a bit of an adventure today to explore those things. Starting by exploring some of the terminology that we use in this space and how this really does connect housing and risk and hazard. And then I will take us back 100 years out here on the West Coast to explore how housing policy, how land use policy, how flood events have affected our overall risk, so that we can get some lessons from that, I hope. And then I'll move on and consider some of the policy levers we have in place, keeping in mind all the things that we will have just learned from our past. And then I will share a few anecdotal and cautionary tales in housing and risk and equity from the last 6 months or so out here on the West Coast. So starting at the top, Many of you will have seen this. I know I recognized a few names on the participant list. So if you are one of the folks who've seen me do this before, get your triangles out. This is the language that I use that I think is very helpful when it comes to climate risks. And this is the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction, or actually Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction, riskier triangle. And it's a simple model of risk, because water isn't the problem or the wildfire isn't the problem. It's the fact that those things interact in a negative way with the things we care about. And in this model of risk, the risk is the area inside the triangle, which has 3 different sides. And as those sides shrink and grow, our risk changes. On the first side, we have hazard. So that's the bad thing. And mostly I will be talking about flood in this context. And of course, our flood will change over time, but this is the bad thing. On the other side of the triangle, we have exposure. So that is the things that interact in the 2-dimensional space with that hazard. It could be infrastructure, it could be housing, it could be people, it could be cultural sites, it could be ecosystems. It's all of those things that we care about that interact with the hazard. And the third vertex of the triangle is the vulnerability or susceptibility of those things being damaged. And personally, I like this framing of this in terms of making this quite simple. The other 2 things, hazard and exposure, are a little more binary, but the vulnerability or sensitivity of things being wet is much more nuanced. And if we think about it on a spectrum, if you're going out into a rainstorm as a human, you can go out without any clothes on, completely naked, or you could be putting on your raincoat, your rain hat, and your wellies and braving the elements. And it's pretty clear that you're going to be much less vulnerable to getting wet and sick and ill and all of those things if you are better prepared and you are putting on your raincoat. We can do the same things to our homes. We can put raincoats on our houses. So it's all of these 3 things that work together to create risk. Of course, risk is not stationary. It is constantly shifting and changing. It has in the past and will in the future. If we just look at where we are today in Canada, we can think about the hazard piece of things. We have clearly, everyone knows, we have climate change, which is affecting our precipitation, which drives our flooding, it affects our snowpack. And importantly, also on the coast, we have changes to relative sea level rise that is increasing our coastal floodplains. Increased storminess in the oceans is also increasing the damage and the waves and the storm surge and all of those things. So our hazard is changing. It's nominally getting worse across most of the country, and it's something that we need to prepare for. We are also in our risk triangle changing and arguably making worse our hazard and our exposure by all of the land use and land cover changings that we're making across the country. So if we look at some fairly recent information from Statistics Canada, much of our natural landscape has been turned into urban areas, and that affects our hazard because it changes our upland runoff areas, and also means that we're putting people in potentially harm's way. We're removing agriculture to create farms and forests to create agriculture, and all of these things are affecting both our hazard and our exposure, and nominally making things worse and increasing our risk. And then on our third side, we also have the idea that we are increasing development in hazard areas. We're increasing development generally. The population of Canada is growing significantly. We are expecting more people to come. And where we put these people will affect our risk and vulnerability. So we have a scenario where we have risk in the present day, and we are anticipating that our risk, if we continue to do things as we currently do things, is going to increase largely into the future. And of course, that risk comes with a lot of consequences to ourselves, to our finances, to our economy, but also very importantly to our housing stock. And so I just want to take everybody on a little bit of an adventure back in time to think about how risk has evolved over time in my corner of the world here, and also how some of the policies that we've put in place, either federally, provincially, as well as other drivers and triggers of change have adjusted our risk over time. So what we're going to be talking about today is the lower mainland of British Columbia. So this is the slice off the corner, at the bottom corner of the mainland of British Columbia. To give those of you who aren't from here a bit of context, this is the Georgia Strait, which is Vancouver Islands off the map here. This basically goes into the Pacific Ocean. I am sitting right over here in downtown Vancouver, which is on this peninsula over here, city of Vancouver. For those of you who've been out here, I know that Dan just told me he's at a conference center right about here in the city of Richmond. And then we move up the Fraser River here, all the way up. And this is the city and community or district of Hope up here. This line here is the US border, and to the north we have mountains. And what I'm showing you on the map here is very illustrative. It's not very scientific or technical, but is merely intended to create a story to explain some of the challenges that we're facing. And what we have on the map is the nominal floodplain of the Fraser River and some of the tributaries, like over here, that flow into the Fraser River, and some of the coastal floodplains that show the overall extent of flooding. And what we'll do is go for a little adventure and show how the risk triangle has evolved over time. So this is our hazard. It's that one side of the triangle. Starting in 1894. So this is the largest flood on the written record. So this occurred 130 odd years ago now. And at the time, there were relatively few people living in the floodplains. So we have a few images here of some sparsely populated areas in Mission that were flooded. This is the city of Chilliwack that was flooded. Many of the First Nation communities who lived here they would have seasonal housing in villages. They would move away from the floodplains during the flood event, so they were not impacted. The Musqueam who lived down here built their homes on stilts, specifically to adapt to these types of events, so they could actually fish off their front porches. Similarly, the Sumac people here also had many of their homes on stilts for the same purpose. So at the time, there was actually very little damage. So the risk overall was quite low from this event, just as a function mostly of an almost collapsed sort of exposure side, as well as the vulnerability side of our triangle. And what I'm going to do now is go through about 100 years of census information, which has been disaggregated. So we looked at 100 years of census and put it onto spatially onto a map. I did this work with Dr. Murray Dernier of Natural Resources Canada quite a few years ago now. And the intent here was to really illustrate myself on flood and himself on earthquake, how our decisions and have evolved risk over time. So what you can see is the floodplain, and then you can also see in the yellows, which will get progressively towards the darker reds, the density of population living within the floodplain. I've also got a graph up here that shows the trend in the overall exposed population, which relates to housing, obviously, on the top here. So in 1921, the first year for which we have data, we had about 15,000 people living on the floodplain. But of course, this was also an era of many changes in the world, including the First World War. And over this period, there was a lot of people coming back from war requiring housings. And there was many houses built across Canada. I don't know whether these were built in the floodplain or even if they were built in British Columbia, but I think this is a good sort of proxy story for all of Canada to explain why, there have been previous shortages of housing and policies to respond to that, which has changed our risk. So over the next 10-year period, we've doubled the population on the floodplain to about 30,000 people, predominantly in the historic centers of city of New Westminster here, a little bit in Vancouver and in Richmond, and out here in the city of Chilliwack. Storming along, we were in the 1920s, roaring 20s, lots of push to grow Canada and to build homes. There was a large increase in building stock, but this fell off as the Great Depression took hold. And so these two sort of balancing factors of this pressure of new people coming in, as well as The Great Depression means that there's not a huge increase in population in the exposed floodplain over time. But some very important policy comes in 1935, starting with the Dominion Housing Act, lots of funding and movement to develop social housing and social housing. And ultimately the CMHC came to be in place not long after. And as a result, we're beginning to see that the population exposed in the floodplain is increasing. Also, over the same period, we have the Fraser River's second largest flood of record, which occurred in 1948. There was about 14,000 cubic meters per second of water passing by Hope up here. And in this instance, the damages were much more significant than in 1894, because going back to our risk triangle, the exposure and the vulnerability had changed significantly over that period. There were many more people living in the floodplain and growing food in the floodplain. And as a result, the damages were fairly significant, including the disruption of the railway for several weeks. So this might remind everybody of what happened in 2021 as well, and I'll get to that in a minute. I'm going to go on a little side tangent here because it's a very good story, at least in my mind as a flood nerd. But in 1948, we had the flood, and at the time, we had some knee-jerk policy response, and I think this is a sort of a cautionary tale for us all to think through. Two gentlemen engineers were summoned from Toronto, and of course I can take umbrage with that. And they were given the mandate to restore the public faith in the diking system, because some of the flooding damages were a result of failed dikes. And of course, with that mandate, they did exactly what they were told to do. And within about 18 months of the flood occurring, the many dikes were built, and the plan was set, and 600 kilometers of dikes were built across the Fraser Valley. Many of these are still here today. And I'm afraid that this knee-jerk policy and this fast movement to respond to a crisis resulted in the board, you can read this yourself, but empirical decisions based only on judgment and experience, and they replaced the usual tedious surveys and calculations. And so this is the dike system that we live with to this day, built in a rush without the usual tedious surveys and calculations. And if you follow the news out here, you know that that has had repercussions right up to the present day, as dikes do not really meet any good standards, nor are they in particularly great spots. Anyways, that's a slight divergence on the story, but I think it's a good one. We're going to go back to our consideration of exposure and population. So we have now all of these protected floodplains, so people are moving into them. And so with that change in policy in the 1940s and the push post-war to bring in more housing, we're seeing more people on the floodplain. Yeah, I just said this, but in 1946, CMHC was formed, and I think this is a really important moment in terms of how the flood exposed population is distributed across the floodplain. So we see this continued uptick in overall exposed population into 1956, and then by in this period, the CMHC created the space for more single-family homes and increase the demand for new suburban neighborhoods. And if you watch this map carefully, you're going to see that, so here's the downtown core of the city of Vancouver. You're going to see these suburban neighborhoods in the city of Richmond, out here in Coquitlam, and here in Surrey and in Delta, expand significantly over the next decade or two because of these changes, alongside with changes in how people get around and highways and all of these other drivers. But there's a definite change in the steepness of our curve over the next few years. And then of course, in the 1960s, the baby boom comes in, and actually lots of multi-family units are developed. And you can see that actually some density increases across the floodplain. So you see these areas in New Westminster and Vancouver and in Richmond where multifamily units are starting to be built, as well as out here in Chilliwack. So we're putting more and more people in harm's way over time. And then we're just going to take off for the next few decades. You can see there's more and more people. We're getting close to 200,000 people here by 1986, which is an important year out here. Expo 86, which told everybody how cool it is to live out here. And then there was a subsequent boom in people moving here and the housing that was required for them. And much of this housing went into the floodplains. 1991, 1996, we have almost 300,000 people in 2001 when there's a significant change in policy out here in the province, where the land use controls, the building controls for hazard areas was devolved from the provincial government down to the local government. And as a result, you will see over the next little while that there's a sudden increase in the population that's living in the floodplain out here in the valley on the edges of what's called the agricultural land reserve. So we had about 300,000 people in 2006, 2012, 2016, and this is where I stopped because I haven't updated this with the latest census information, but we have about 350,000 people in the floodplain in 2016, and projections from Stats Canada up to about 500,000 people by 2050. That is a lot of people that we have put in harm's way over time, and on reflection of all of those stories, a lot of it was probably very unintentional. It was a desire to push through housing post-war, during both of the world wars or post those wars. During the baby boom, there was a need and a desire for housing, and housing policy sort of trumped anything related to the potential future damages associated with putting those people in harm's way. And as we know, this is the result. Flood is Canada's most costly and frequent natural hazard. This is, you know, a tale from out here on the West Coast, but it's probably repeated across the country in many, many places. So it's an important history for us to all to be aware of, so that we can try and minimize repeating some of those mistakes into the future. And so now that we've sort of casted back, I just wanted to go forward in time a little bit and consider what we can be doing to maybe try and avoid some of those mistakes of the past. So consider some of the policy levers that we have to support risk reduction. So going back to the risk triangle, I use it all the time, as you might be able to tell. It has three sides, and that means that, you know, you can shrink your risk using three separate groups of levers that are very important. And traditionally, we've really been focused on this hazard piece in terms of avoiding, we're trying to stop the water. But there are two other sides to this triangle, and there's lots of space in here, especially for those of you on the call who have maybe some modicum of control over the exposure element, and certainly over the vulnerability element through how buildings are built. So at the very least, I think it's important, and I hope you do too, we need to not make our hazard worse through building choices that we're making when we're putting in new subdivisions or new buildings or new houses, ensuring that they are designed with the ecosystem in mind, that we're looking at low carbon resilience options to ensure that we are at the very least not expanding our hazard, and we're trying to hold the line on the hazard. Is a very important piece of the puzzle. We also, very importantly, and I think this is something that I'm beginning to get a little bit panicky about as I watch this drive for housing, is we should at the very least avoid targeting development, and especially high density development, into these high hazard areas. So Chad off the top said that 10% of our current housing stock is in that high hazard area approximately. We would like to not make that 11% or even worse than that. But to do that, we are missing some very important tools. We need to have comprehensive and consistent flood maps that are available to everyone, but also consider future flood hazard as much as possible, so that we have the tools in place to be able to make those informed decisions, whether it is a funding agency or a provincial government or a local government with their zoning tools, or even an individual developer. Just having that information can support not putting development in those high risk areas. We also need the policy and the regulations in place to limit development, and we need to make sure they're not being trumped by other things that are going on. And I think there's that example, which I sort of glossed over, but here is that the provincial government devolved the control over land use development in floodplains to the local government in 2004. And that was entirely driven by development pressures and by agricultural lobbyists and other people. And it trumped the sort of the need or the sort of sensible approach in terms of trying to limit our future hazard and risk and losses. So there's a lot of things that we need to do on the policy side of things, especially with the regulatory piece, to ensure that we are not making this worse. And then thirdly, and I know we have some other much more expert people on the call here today who could speak to this, but we need those financial policies in place to limit that investment, whether it's insurance policies, whether it's investment funds. We need to ensure that we're not spending public money for sure, and individuals are not spending their private money to invest in places that will ultimately be at risk, and we're going to lose them, and we're going to lose this housing stock in the future. And this third side of this triangle, I think, is really where I think we have so much potential that we're not currently exploring. And it's around putting the raincoats on our built environment, on our houses, on our infrastructure. So we need those updated building codes that Dan was speaking to at the beginning of the call. I also think we need to create, pilots and examples and a market, a flourishing market, where there are people out there that can support individual homeowners or developers to design buildings to be better flood-proofed. We need a market for this expertise and these products, and I think it's slowly growing, but it's not there yet. And I'm just going to throw out my absolute favorite book, and if you haven't seen this book, I encourage you to go find it. But this is an example of something that's from the UK, but I think is something that we would benefit from here. And it's basically a toolbox of all the things we can do in our homes, small scale and big scale, to put the raincoats on our buildings and our infrastructure. Because if we don't take this future lens and we don't make these good decisions now, even if they feel really hard when we face this pressure of housing, this immediate housing shortage, we will end up with a long-term housing shortage because the life cycle of the buildings that we're putting in harm's way is going to be short. We're basically shooting ourselves, our future selves, into the foot. It's also going to be very costly. We're through the investment. This isn't a very good investment. And of course, then there's always the cost that's not financial, the trauma associated with being flooded. We need to use this future lens. We need to make these really hard choices now, and some of them actually aren't so hard. Some of this low-hanging fruit that we just need to push away the obstacles that are currently in place so we can make these things happen. And then I just wanted to go into a few stories of some recent events here. And I know Chad had asked me specifically to speak about the November 2021 atmospheric river. And I'll throw it up here on the slide. So this was a very important event. And I think in terms of that sort of backcasting on these levers, the story here is that, flooding isn't something that's not going to happen into the future. We are across Canada experiencing flooding on a yearly basis. So in 2021, it was pretty bad out here, but then last year, flooding in Nova Scotia, flooding in Yukon. So it's flooding somewhere across the country every single year. So we're going to, if we continue to make foolish decisions about where we're putting and siting our housing and building it in poor ways, we are going to lose a portion of our housing stock. So if we're investing all of this money now, let's make sure that we're not losing our housing stock in the future, and that we're making a smart investment. So a couple of stories here from the SUMAS November 2021 event. So for those of you who don't remember, we had what's called an atmospheric river roll over British Columbia in mid-November 2021. And this area here is actually a drained lake. Samath Oksta was the lifeblood of the Samath people up until the 1920s, when the provincial government of the day, a bunch of engineers drained this lake. You can kind of see it draining again. And effectively what happened is all of the rain from the atmospheric river landed on the nearby mountains in our own system here in the Chilliwack-Chilcoyac watershed, but also landed to the south of us in the US into the Nooksack watershed, which is another river system. But this area is very flat, and so they're intricately connected. And the Nooksack overflowed. It flowed north. The dikes that were built many years ago without those tedious surveys, although these ones had been upgraded, failed, and the lake was reformed. And so this entire area was very, very wet. And so it really speaks to the fact that this is something that does happen, and that there was some significant impacts, probably to everybody on this call. Those of you who are out here probably felt it more closely, but if you were in Toronto, even if you were in Halifax, the major transportation routes that connect the Port of Vancouver and therefore China, and all of those cheap plastic trinkets we all tend to buy, are connected to you through these various transportation corridors that were underwater and closed during the flood event. And I just want to sort of draw your attention in terms of the housing piece of this. Obviously, this is agricultural land, so not dense suburban housing. It's not going to solve our housing supply, but I think there's some really interesting sort of cautionary tales from in here. So this is the lake bottom here, and I'm just going to take you to the bottom of the lake, which is approximately here. This is what we have at the bottom of the lake. So in 2014, we had agricultural lands. If you think about our risk triangle, relatively invulnerable to flooding. But even though we know this is a floodplain, there's a flood construction level in place in 2023. I'm not sure if this was built pre or post flood. I was trying to figure that out this morning, but I didn't get there in time. There is a enormous multi-generational mansion built at the bottom of the lake. So for reference, the bottom of the lake is at about 0 meters geodetic. The flood construction level, that is the, how high the lake or deep the lake would flood, is about 7 meters. So our flood construction level is somewhere up here at the roof. And in fact, if during the flood, this would have been flooded to the rafters if it was there. And to me, this really highlights that, we're competing against all of these other drivers as folks thinking about climate change and climate risks and physical risks, because there's so many other drivers that are really strong that are pushing away all of the regulations and policies we'd like to have in place. The zoning and building controls in this area are relatively weak as it relates to flood because it's farm first, it's food security first. So there will be a covenant on title on this building to indemnify the local government, which is the city of Abbotsford, from any losses. But they ultimately would have got a variance because they are in the agricultural land reserve, and it's important to have the farmers on the farm. So there's, there's some controls that are much too weak. I would argue this, could have been built better, even if it's not built up. It could have been built using other flood-proofing tools. And I imagine that the financial tools are also not working in this case. Presumably, these folks don't have a mortgage because they wouldn't have been able to get insurance for this house. But what probably happened, which is more, I think, even a sadder tale, is that it's a multi-generational house. I'm making this all up, but I can sort of assume that many members of this family clubbed together all of their savings to buy and build this house in this spot. And then they're basically putting that all at risk because they have no other mechanism to manage that residual risk. The other thing that I've noticed in this the last few months is housing has become a bigger issue, and we're seeing this now competing with climate and future lens and flood risk reduction is something that maybe, I'm not actually sure, but it's definitely something that's happening out here in British Columbia. So out here we have what's called Bill 44, which is a piece of legislation that came into play last fall. And it's a housing first policy. And I would like to say it's housing first and everything else be damned. So for example, one thing I have noticed is that there's a loss of interest in what's called the BC flood strategy. So this is a very forward-looking piece of documentation that has been evolved in the last few years. It follows all of the international best practice, and was setting the stage to do some really cool things here in British Columbia, especially around ecosystem restoration and reduction in exposure and in reduction in vulnerability. But the interest had just disappeared. And my reference point for this is looking at throne speeches over the last few years and watching how flood has tailed off dramatically. And instead, we're seeing housing rise. And they instead of working together, we are sort of working in opposition at the moment. I've also noticed anecdotally, working with a lot of local governments out here, that all of a sudden, flood mitigation plans that were going to be going to council with bylaws in place and zoning to get people out of the floodway, out of those high hazard areas, have suddenly been pulled back. They're not going to councils, and that's because there's this fear of flooding or fear of meeting the housing targets. I'm almost done, Chad. And also I've also just on a capacity level noticed that a lot of long-range planners who are working on climate adaptation and climate risks are all of a sudden working on housing instead. And then my final tale of caution, I think, is making sure that sort of everybody who's thinking about this space is aware of issues of equity in this area. So we have a lot of haves and have-nots. And one thing I have noticed, so we do this in this office, we work for real estate investment trusts, we work for developers who hold a lot of commercial or industrial or housing stock across the country to help them make really good informed decisions about the physical climate risks to their building stock. And often they are divesting from stock that's going to be, ruined or flooded or under some other hazard in future. But of course, they're selling to somebody else. And I think this is, so that same picture I showed you, this is from a June 2023 Google shot. There's, someone's tried to sell this house and I think probably did sell it in June 2023, 2 years after the flood. Did they know about the risk? It is covenant untitled, but did they really read it? I do note that it says new price over here. So, there's, fire sale. People are coming in and making different choices because they don't have the same information. And this is something I think that is concerning to me going forward and something that we need to collectively work on to make sure that we are addressing these issues of equity. So as not to leave everybody with all of these depressing thoughts, I did want to remind everybody that the triangle has 3 sides. And to date, a lot of that risk that we have created was really caused by us humans making foolish decisions, some knee-jerk policies, and also not recognizing the complexity or the wickedness of housing and climate. But of course, because humans made the problem, I would hope that with some humility, we could also solve the problem. That's it.
Thank you so much. And in the world of Zoom, we can't really do that kind of the virtual clapping, I guess, but I really appreciate that. I know that many of us found that very enriching discussion. We have time allotted for questions and answers after both presenters today. But at this point, I think I'm going to propose so that we have time to hear from Dawn and have time to have some interaction. Maybe we can limit to sort of 2 kind of follow-up questions if people raise their hands or shout out. As to, so I'm going to go back to my screen here. But I think what we'll do is we'll kind of collapse our roundtable updates at the end, which is a little bit of a buffer time for us. And this will, if I don't see any folks at this point raising a hand, it'll be fine. And we'll move into I think we're going to move over back to you, Dan, then.
I got a quick question, if you don't.
Okay, Kyle.
Very, very good presentation. I found that extremely interesting. Maybe just a quick comment. You did such a good job at explaining all that. When you talk about solutions, the raincoat for the existing infrastructure sitting within the floodplains, I'm out here on the prairie, so we don't really have as much exposure to that type of thing. In these condensed examples like Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, they're like, what are some of maybe the raincoat options available?
Such a good question. And there are so many things I think that we could be doing both to retrofit buildings that are currently in place, as well as when we're doing new builds. And it's really about reframing how we're thinking about this and more thinking about living with the water and accepting that these buildings are going to get wet and making sure that we're building them in a way that we can recover really quickly. So as an individual, like super easy example, I mean, you can just Google this stuff, especially if you look at the UK and Australia. There's a lot of really wonderful YouTube videos of various pensioners going around their homes, showing you all the things that they have done to make them more flood resilient. It can be as simple as moving your electrical outlets up, changing your, what do you call it? The stuff you put on the walls. I always get it wrong. you can change things. You can change your wood floors for tile floors. You can change your walls for flood resilient materials. There's a lot of really simple things that you can be doing. And then at a neighborhood scale, there's even bigger things you can do when you're doing new builds. Yes, you can be developing not using the ground floor for your man cave with all of your electronics. That's probably totally insensitive. But not putting all of that kind of stuff in the bottom. But you can also be developing, either, ring guides for the communities or individual temporary protections that go around. There's a lot of really good examples. And again, I'm going to throw up the book. This is my favorite book. I will put a link in the chat, or maybe someone else can find it. The Retrofitting for Flood Resilience. There's just so many examples of things that we could be doing. And we are beginning to see those examples on the ground here. So for example, out here in Vancouver, the MEC headquarters building has a bunch of floodproofing associated with its construction. So they have less important things on the ground floor. And then they also have some temporary barriers that will come up and protect parts of it. And we're seeing that across the country roll out, but not very many examples. And I'm sure maybe there's other folks on the call who can share some other examples, because I'm always looking for them. But there's many things we could be doing.
New York City has been iterating resilient infrastructure guidelines, including flooding, getting electrical out of the basement too. There's so much more. What a great presentation, Tamsin. Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our next speaker.
Sure, great. Thanks, Chad. And thanks, Tamsin. Hopefully we do have some more time at the end for questions. I've got a couple questions actually for Tamsin, but we'll save it till later on. So thanks very much, Don Iveson, for making time to present to us today. I'll give you a quick intro and then I'll pass it over to Don. So Don Iveson served as mayor of Edmonton from 2013 to 2021. During that time, he played an important role in shaping Edmonton's city plan and city council's energy transition strategy. He's currently serving as executive advisor for the Climate Investment and Community Resilience Program at Cooperators, where he continues to contribute to climate-related initiatives. He's also a distinguished member of the expert panel on adaptation at the Canadian Climate Institute, and he serves as co-chair for the Task Force on Housing and Climate, which I think is particularly pertinent to his discussion today. So I'll pass it over to Don. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Dan. Great to be with you all here. I think Tamsin stole a lot of the thunder. So I'm going to move through some slides quickly here because there's lots to drill into, but I'm just going to give you a high-level overview and then a couple of reflections on the topic and try to leave time for some discussion. So glad to be here with you all. So the blueprint was a really extraordinary project to get to be a part of. You can find all the details at housingandclimate.ca, and I put a link in the chat earlier to my Substack, which has lots of other links to related resources, case studies we were looking at, and some analysis on it. So this was the task force and is the task force, though really the task force's work is wrapped up, but I'm sticking around to help do presentations like these to governments and stakeholder groups of one kind or another. So appreciate the opportunity to present to you. Obviously, you'll see, folks from a number of walks of life, many parts of the country, coast to coast to coast, many industries. And there have been lots of housing task forces out there and the odd climate task force, but no one had moved into the gap here. So the Clean Economy Fund rallied some dollars from a number of philanthropic groups who saw the need to address some of the questions that Tamsin was just alluding to, but also on the emissions side, ensuring that this new housing that gets built doesn't make our climate challenges worse. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but this was a really extraordinary opportunity. There were insurers, finance people, designers, planners, housing experts, academics, practitioners. It was a great group. And then we also had access to a number of research partners, including Dan and the folks at ICLR for some additional fresh research to support the work. And very importantly, it was a cross-partisan effort and meant to address all orders of government with recommendations. We did not presume to make recommendations to Indigenous governments in this, although we had Indigenous task force members and engaged with a number of First Nations and Indigenous-led organizations working in the housing space. we confined ourselves to the three orders of government. But we do recognize that there's some pretty extraordinary leadership happening in Indigenous-led organizations and housing resilience and sustainability on the part of Indigenous Canadians and organizations. So it was a quick turnaround project with really an assignment to come up with a blueprint for how to deliver these millions of more homes than would have been built otherwise within as short a time frame as possible in a low carbon and resilient way. The goals ultimately clarified to an outcome that those houses should be low carbon and not impact or undermine our climate targets and the emissions reductions plan, that they should be resilient, which I'm going to expand on further to Tamsin's presentation, that they need to be affordable at the end of the day. And we took a long view on the definition of affordability that includes aspects of resilience, efficiency to operate, and durability of the housing, because there's a lot of false economy in building housing that is maladapted to even today's weather, much less what we can reasonably predict we'll be facing over the life of that asset, which could easily be more than 100 years. And we have to do this at scale. So we gave that some thought as well. So the blueprint, again, has some overarching recommendations that cross-cut across orders of government, and I'll highlight a few of those, and then drills down into specific recommendations for each order of government. Very pleased to see the federal government adopt a number of these in the housing strategy. I think 17 of them or something like that were addressed in one way or another in the announcements leading up to budget and in the budget. They focus primarily on supply and on land use considerations and servicing and infrastructure, though some of them are aligned, generally speaking, with the climate objectives, though clearly the climate, neither transition nor adaptation were the framing of the budget, but our friends in the government insist that they have not lost sight of those imperatives as well. And more will come on that on the building retrofit side. So really, to boil it down, we thought there were 4 game changers that were necessary to achieve the scaled, resilient, low carbon supply acceleration that we were trying to build a strategy around. The first was really around land use, and we framed it as legalizing density, which is happening, and federal dollars are incenting and tied to that, and there are great debates happening. But I can tell you from Edmonton, where we have essentially done this over the last 10 years, everything from eliminating parking minimums to fourplexes. I know these things are controversial in some folks' minds, but I'm reporting to you live from Edmonton here that the city has not burned to the ground as a result. As a matter of fact, this is one of the few large Canadian cities where folks can actually still afford to buy a house, although rents have shot up a lot. So with 65,000 people moving to Edmonton last year. So the demand is exceeding supply here too, and it's beginning to have an impact, but we're trying to keep up with a lot of legalized density and accelerating development within the existing footprint, leveraging that infrastructure. Building codes, we'll talk about a little bit more. I know that's a topical looking at the chat. Factory built housing is sort of the industrial policy component of how to actually deliver the bricks and mortar or sticks and roofs, if you prefer. And finally, this issue of high risk. I couldn't have said it better than Tamsin just did in the presentation. So I actually won't dwell on that too much, just other than to say that I think our task force, which included the president of IBC and then me wearing my cooperator's hat at times, that we violently agree with that recommendation. So on legalizing density, we'll make sure you have these slides. There are elements of resilience here. Generally speaking, this is a good thing from an overall climate standpoint, provided nature is coming in, provided water is being managed, provided heat is being managed. The net positives of density, particularly with respect to embodied carbon, are significant, but there are maladaptive potential consequences around runoff, obviously, and urban heat island effect. So some trades there, but we think this is better than spreading out across vulnerable areas and the traditional land use pattern of the 20th century. Building codes, and I could go deeper on this, but we think this is not only an issue from an energy standpoint, but clearly from a resilience standpoint, but also from an affordability standpoint. You know, we focused on the single egress, single point access rules, for example. So we argued for some changes to building code that should reduce the regulatory burden and reduce construction costs. But we also believe really fundamentally from a consumer protection standpoint that the codes are not strong enough for those asset owners, particularly where that asset owner is a family that has no, you know, professional background in these issues, and really selling people or allowing houses to be built that are not resilient, and also, by the way, locking emissions is frankly negligent from a governmental standpoint. So we think the whole process actually needs to be overhauled because it advances too slowly for the risk profile at the rate the risk profile is changing. Factory built, I could go on and on about because we think it plays a critical role, but maybe for this audience, I'll skip, other than to say that what you see on the left here is the factory producing stackable modules that are all wood, and in Sweden and many parts of Scandinavia, they will build even apartment buildings using either modular or panelized approaches. But in this case, these volumetric modules can stack up to 12 stories high, and the same model you see on the left is what's assembled into a finished building on the right. And in those parts of the world, well over half of housing and up to 80% of single family housing is built using some factory built approach, which is the only way we're going to overcome our labor supply challenges and increase output. But it's also an opportunity for much higher quality control and for cost containment to offset increases in code that increase the quality and durability and safety and performance of buildings. So we think the only way this is going to work, the only way that we're going to achieve the scale that we need and to do it in a resilient and efficient way, is by significant investments in factory built approaches of many kinds, you know, offsite construction of panels as well as potentially modular. This works in Sweden, by the way, because they can barge these modules down. So that's not automatically transferable given hauling distances and other constraints to all places in Canada. So more here on the measures that can be taken to accelerate that. Finally, again, we're in very, very strong agreement about this issue of development in high-risk areas. The most expensive home is the one you need to rebuild after an extreme weather event. So whether you're in the affordability frame or the climate frame, it really is irresponsible, bordering on negligent, to allow more development to occur in these areas. And that includes the wildland urban interface, but for our purposes today, particularly where water hazard is well understood technically, but not necessarily disclosed to buyers and not necessarily even taken adequately into account in the land use planning process. So we think that, again, zooming in on each three order of government, that mapping and disclosing those hazards is the responsibility of municipalities, and where it's feasible to invest in mitigation to manage that, though that's getting harder and harder to do with the scale of water that we're likely to see. But in some places, there may be works that may help manage water, though that can also lead to sort of a false sense of security and exacerbate moral hazard. Provinces have very, very strong role to play in this, since they control, for the most part, or at least would have jurisdiction over these decisions, whether they're delegated to municipalities or not, and have some liability through the DFAA process ultimately. So we're very, very strong on provinces acting much more diligently with respect to this, and potentially reassuming jurisdiction, and again, also disclosing this. And the federal government, again, has been a strong push on mapping and transparency there as part of the National Adaptation Strategy implementation. And then this is maybe the most important point where I can go a little bit deeper, which is around aligning incentives to minimize risk. So again, the moral hazard challenge shows up here, where the assumption is that the federal government and provincial government will come in and rebuild over and over and over again. And the Parliamentary Budget Officer has identified since 2016 that that's already on an unsustainable and ballooning track. So we have some responses to that in the form of the new high-risk flood insurance program that the federal government is bringing to market to deal with that 10% high-risk area or high-risk exposure set of properties. But the design of that will be critical to not exacerbate the moral hazard and again reinforce false sense of security. So for example, new development in those high-risk areas, if it's also eligible for the new program, that just de-risks bad land use and development control decisions. So that and increases the federal government's liability. So the federal government really needs to be careful with the design of that new program, not to inadvertently make this program worse. And it's being framed as an affordable high-risk flood insurance program, which masks two things. One, the fact that there will be a considerable long-term subsidy required for this. And if designed improperly, that could wind up looking a lot like the FEMA program, which props up development in high-risk areas in the United States and represents ultimately a balance sheet level challenge for that country. We could wind up in the same situation, inadvertently creating incentives that increase overall risk exposure. So there's a lot of art to designing that properly. We have a little bit of insight into that because Cooperators is one of the few groups that offers in all of those high-risk areas up to the very ultra high risk. We just send an accurate price signal about what that risk is to those willing to pay it. So it's not affordable, but it is high risk coverage. And so we have a sense of what that takes, but recognize that, so just to correct something Chad said, it's not that you can't, it's not that properties are uninsurable, it's just that most insurers will not touch those high risk areas. If you're in one of them and you're concerned, feel free to reach out to your local Cooperators representative. Not that I'm here to sell you all insurance today, but so getting those incentives right is critical. The one other thing I'll say about this is that, and this is important to look into, is that OSFI, the financial regulator, has just confirmed what's called B15, which is their latest guidance or really regulation with respect to implementation of IFRS climate-related disclosures. So if any of you have been following TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, this is the implementation in Canada of the requirement for insurers and banks, i.e. lenders, to look at and disclose their climate-related chronic and acute physical risk and other things related to climate, but particularly for our purposes here, the risk in their lending portfolio related to water or fire. And that's going to have a powerful incentive shifting impact on the marketplace when lenders begin to realize how much risk they have in those high risk areas like the Lower Mainland. And that may affect not just insurability, but creditworthiness and credit access. And those tools may be part of what come to bear to change the incentive framework around new development and even adjustments to existing asset prices. And Intact's done some neat work where they looked at impact in flood exposed areas where that flood risk is known because it has manifested in the form of a disaster, and that can be anywhere from 3 to 20% impact on property values. So to the extent that there may be overvalued assets in these high risk areas, that starts to be at the scale of materiality that, a Royal Bank or a Van City Credit Union will not only need to start to pay attention to, but have to disclose. So that's going to change incentives at the macro on the financial side. We had a lot more to say about how to deliver housing, how to ensure it was affordable for those who need it the most. On the non-market side, just an explanation of the terminology of the housing spectrum. An awful lot of housing is needed on the left side and up to the blue, where there is some degree of partnership perhaps for delivery, but ensuring long-term affordability of those units for folks who cannot afford to participate in the market. Our sense is that could be a sizable portion, up to 2.3 million of the units that are needed need to be delivered here. And it's equally important, if those are going to be publicly owned, that they also not be assets that are at risk. So this discussion applies both to the non-market and public housing segment as much as to the market component. I will just mention for this group that our overall analysis was that climate insensitive policies around development will lock in 100 megatons of annual GHG emissions by 2030. So we're particularly preoccupied with building efficiency, but ultimately where we build, what we build, how we build, and remembering why we're building and for whom in the first place are the lenses we need to mediate the adaptability of our housing to the risks that we know today and can see coming. These are the folks who were generous enough to support this activity, and then in the funders and the research folks who assisted us, including Dan at ICLR. So grateful again for that. I will stop sharing and happy to get into dialogue around these.
Great, thanks, Don. If anybody does have questions, feel free to jump in. You can put your hand up or enter them into the chat, and we'll make sure they get read out. I have a question actually for both our presenters. Both of you have mentioned the importance of not building in hazard-prone areas. Tamsin was talking about the Fraser Delta, Fraser Valley. Don, you mentioned not just floodplains, but also wildland fire-prone areas. I think you're referencing like soup bowl areas in urban areas that are outside the floodplain, that sort of thing, where we know water accumulates, but we don't disclose that information to the public. Tamsin, and sort of the experience over the past 20 years working this area, we seem to be going in the wrong direction when it comes to understanding, communicating, and regulating development in hazard-prone areas. And so you mentioned specifically the downloading of responsibility for floodplains, floodplain management, mapping, et cetera, to municipalities in BC. And we've seen it in Ontario in the 90s, defunding of the conservation authorities and so on. They managed to hold on amazingly. So a question is to both of you, what is the role of land use regulation specifically? Don, you mentioned some financial tools that could be brought to bear, incentives and so on, that might result in better decisions for locating of development. But failing land use planning, regulation in hazard-prone areas, what are the next most powerful tools that we can apply starting in the near term? And I'd also ask, how do we get to a place where we can actually implement these options? I think sometimes you look at like this study, like the blueprint, there's a lot of recommendations there. If we were to think about an incremental approach, what should we focus on first in the near term, and who should take responsibility for those initial actions? Maybe Don, I'll ask you first, and then Tamsin.
Sure. I mean, there are things below the level of land use at the building regulation side. So, moving electricity ducts out of basements, for example, that's a development permit condition on the flood fringe in the River Valley in Edmonton, has been since the 80s. So the municipalities have some jurisdiction to manage those risks. In Langley, British Columbia, they're in their flood fringe, they essentially require the first floor development to be, used for parking and essentially be sacrificial. They do the same thing in Baltimore for when the hurricanes come in. It's all, and you have early warning and you can move the cars out. I think you raised an interesting point a minute ago about the challenge with pluvial flooding events on the flatland. We see a lot of that in Edmonton, and our stormwater integrated resource plan that EPCOR is implementing is a response to that pluvial risk, which is not as well understood. But there are certainly things that municipalities can do to manage that risk on the stormwater side. A lot of nature-based solution potential, for example, but then still working with residents to deploy sensors and flood-proofing, backflow valves, all of those other measures. There's a lot of property level hardening program and regulation that municipalities can take into their hands, though that's kind of remedial for historic high-risk decisions. Though as the risk profile changes, and Swiss Re's just put out their report a couple of months ago, and like that what's driving losses in North America is severe convective storms and these short duration, high intensity precipitation events. And so that's a lot of water in a pluvial context. And I think municipalities are going to are kind of on their heels in that in a lot of cases, but there's a lot that can be done autonomously. I would say that Sarah Miller's on the call here from the Climate Institute, and this is one of the areas of study right now, is what else can be done to move policy levers at all levels. So Sarah could probably say more, but there's going to be a great piece of work coming from the Institute soon on that. The last thing I would say is the other piece besides land use, where I think this gets interesting, is, and it was Christine, I think, put a comment in the chat about litigation risk. So this is starting to shift. Municipalities have traditionally been sort of well indemnified against these things, but where it is reasonably predictable, especially around fluvial, that they're or coastal potentially, that a risk will develop over time. If they do approve a project, then I think there's quite a bit of room for litigation risk to begin to manifest. And so those climate risks can include not just the hazard itself, but also litigation and potentially reputation risk that becomes material to a municipality. And then you run all that forward, that starts to go potentially to the municipality's creditworthiness for its own infrastructure that it may need to build to defend, right? So I think there are a number of places where this can show up, but from a decision-making standpoint, a municipality might, once there is precedent, there's a number of cases pending right now, so there's no guidance on this yet, but I think at some point, some boneheaded decision is going to lead to liability, at least for the municipality, if not the decision makers, and that precedent will start to have to shift behavior too. So in addition to the land use itself, I think there's a few other moving pieces here that to keep an eye on.
Great, thanks, Don. Tamsin, any thoughts?
Sure. I might add that I hope we don't go down the litigation route. I don't know if you're following the stories out here, but there's been some news in the last week or so that has complicated the good direction things were going. So I think that's anyway, I hope that we don't go that way, but I recognize that maybe that is a back pocket tool that maybe we can use for good, but for now I think it's being used for evil. It's my personal opinion there. But I think one of the other things I have noticed on the land use control side is that we don't have many good examples for communities to follow when it comes to the language in the bylaws, the language in what out here are called development permit areas and their official community plans. And no one's really willing to be first in that space because they're concerned about issues of politics and issues of litigation and all of those things. And so I think what it really comes down to is better educating our planners so that they can bond together and make really good choices and to start developing the tools and the templates for other municipalities to be using. And at the same time, I think education is pretty key here too for our developers so that they can understand what these tools are that Don was just mentioning, that's in my favorite book over there, and that there's really marginal cost associated with putting these things in at this state. And so if they just know that those tools exist, it's easier for them to access it. We're going to see more of this on the ground, and we're going to see even more of it on the ground if the public is more aware of these risks, and that this is the biggest investment they're likely, especially if you're buying a home, the biggest investment you're going to make in your life. You want to make a smart investment, and whether that's buying not in the high flood areas, but it's buying a home that has been flood proofed, it's a much better decision. So a lot of this to me is really about education of all of those levels of people. So I appreciate the opportunity today to chat and share.
Great, thanks, Tamsin. Maybe more disclosure of the issues they're seeing in Quebec with not issuing, well, there was a big announcement by Desjardins in the last few weeks that they weren't going to issue mortgages to homes in 20-year return period floodplain. And I understand it's not just Desjardins, it's other lenders as well. But on the flip side, you also have your new construction that you pointed out in an area where they should be 7 meters above the base flood elevation, but still seem to be incented to live there for some reason. Anyway, sorry, we could go down a rabbit hole, but there's a question here from Nick for Don, that you mentioned there were several recommendations that were adopted by federal government. Could you just give a quick rundown of which of those recommendations were adopted?
Yeah, I mean, there was a major theme of attaching conditionality to dollars. And so the new 6 billion, sort of building on the Housing Accelerator Fund, which said to municipalities, you will get dollars if you make changes to your land use bylaw. And those are essentially the legalized density changes. And then the 6 billion additional housing focused infrastructure dollars also have some conditionality around them. Which essentially align with the pro-density infrastructure efficiency and speed to delivery recommendations. They did not take up so much conditionality around climate risk assessment before a development proceeds, which I think the federal government's and INFC, I see the question comes from INFC, has articulated in many conversations I've had with the government on the administrative side, the desire to shift from a passive infrastructure investor to an informed infrastructure investor. And I mean, there are for certain projects, things like PIVC assessments and other climate vulnerability screens, but that's where the funding is direct to a project often. I think making clear an expectation that both the housing that is the ultimate outcome, but the infrastructure that enables that housing has been climate risk assessed is fair conditionality to put out there. And to the extent you've got provinces like mine saying, we refuse to, or we decline to have you raise those questions directly with municipalities, that really opens the opportunity to have that conversation with the province. And now where the province is in sort of build, baby, build mode, it may be challenging to do that. But I think using the dollars as carrots ideally, but also potentially as sticks, and saying, and this is at the far end, saying that new development that doesn't have those risk assessments and puts not only the infrastructure, but the houses and the community and the economy and the households and families and individuals themselves at risk, is not going to get backstop from DFAA or the high risk flood insurance program. So I do, all to say sort of the logical extent of our conditionality, argument was partially taken up around land use. And then the question also is about multiple orders of government. It's a lot of municipalities, frankly, wanted to go there in their heart of hearts, but over the years have felt pushback from the NIMBY forces, for example. Though I've seen, interestingly enough, just in my own community, that the not in my backyard anti-density arguments are now adopting climate resilience as an argument not to increase land use intensity around permeable surface, which unmitigated could be an issue over time at scale, though fortunately that was not a persuasive argument with our council. But giving the courage to municipalities to align on the legalized density, as Calgary just did recently, despite enormous headwinds, that's a good example where it's starting to work. But then you're also getting this sort of snapback from the government of Alberta. But plus ça change, plus ça reste la même.
Great, thanks, Don. Stephanie, did you have a question? Okay, I see somebody unmuted themselves, but that's okay. Don, another thing you mentioned is the code development process. And oh, sorry, Sarah Miller, please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks. I thought I'd just jump in. And thanks, Don, for giving us a little shout out. Yeah, so like Don mentioned, I'm working with the Climate Institute. We're doing a report very relevant to everything that we're talking about here. So thank you both for the presentation. Looking at new housing development, where it's likely to go under status quo policies and what that means from a risk perspective, looking both at wildfires and flooding. So I really appreciate everything you said. I'm just wondering, one of the things that we're grappling with a little bit is sort of the treatment of flood and wildfire risk separately versus together, and kind of talking about the extent of the challenge and also the most appropriate policy solutions. And one thing that's come up a fair number of times is that, you know, regulation may be more appropriate in terms of not siting new homes in risky areas. From a flooding perspective, but from a wildfire perspective, either it's more challenging politically, given where some of the communities are growing, or mitigation measures are more effective or more cost effective or more reliable potentially at the community or household level. So we could have a sort of a more of an emphasis on those measures from a wildfire perspective and maybe less from a flood perspective. So I just wanted to ask you both for your thoughts on sort of, the value of talking with them separately, or what issues might come up separately for flood versus wildfire, and that appropriateness of regulation versus the mitigation piece in particular.
Maybe I can take a stab at this one, Sarah. And I think, actually, I'm pretty sure Don saw me speak. This is my pet thing, is the multi-hazard space, because we really need to be conscious of the choices that we're making, so we're not maladapting. And I'm remembering a presentation I gave a long time ago about like putting our houses on stilts, and I was in an audience with a bunch of seismic folks who immediately came up and literally slapped me on the wrist for considering an option that's going to tipple over out here. So we really need to be conscious of all of the risk, and that's something I don't think we have a lot of information on. I was just trying to find Metro Vancouver out here just in the last couple of months released some sort of first level multi-hazard maps to try and show where the hazards are overlain to support. No, I'll try and pop a link in a second to try and support that conversation around the regulatory piece about not citing, especially high density and the sort of infrastructure, those nodes that create over time all of that development and all of that risk, to support not making things worse than they are through this multi-hazard lens. And then I think the other piece is to really focus on those resilience measures that are going to be the biggest bang for your buck across all of the hazards, and not focusing on the hazard specific resilience measures. So unfortunately for all this, the folks here are probably, you know, engineers and the like, it's really the stuff in the social space around recovery and social services and creating good communities that are going to respond to these things. I'm sure there are things in the building space that we can be doing, but we need to be really conscious of the maladaptation and start building out the tools to understand where these hazards are overlapping and where our mitigation measures are going to maladapt to some other hazard.
Yeah, I think that's just the do no significant harm theme is important, especially on the fire risk mitigation side, because I mean, on one extreme, the best way to deal with the wildland urban interface would be to eliminate it by cutting it back, you know, 2 or 3 kilometers or whatever the you know, the ember throw kind of risk is in a given fuel type. But that's the extreme. There's a variety of other things you can do in between, starting at the property level, fire smart, but then also, you know, resilient roofing, upgrades, changing the siding, all of those other things to reduce the threat to the community. But you've still got these smoke issues, you've still got evacuation impacts, all these other things, and at the scale of the landscape, that risk is rising for a variety of interesting reasons. I just came from a wildfire conference that, you know, traces it all the way back to not just the making illegal of the use of fire and the change of the timber regimen to be more monocultural, but all the way back to, you know, depopulation of indigenous communities, and all that is precedent to climate change. So now you've got these very fuel intense loaded monocultures that are also now themselves as forests maladapted potentially to the conditions that they're seeing in a hotter, drier, and then add more wind to the situation, and literally we have the perfect firestorm. But it is a very different sort of physics and problem how to manage wildfire than water. Water at least obeys gravity, makes it a little bit easier to plan for. Now, our capabilities, and we're working with some folks at UBC on this, who are, you know, building models that can predict how fire will behave. But at the end of the day, the hazard source is the fuel accumulation. So that is differently mitigatable, and structures are differently fortifiable against those risks. So I think it does follow, to Sarah, to your question, it's probably a different set of answers, but at the end of the day, a whole bunch of things you might do to manage fuel loads and try to reduce fires can have positive effects on watersheds, or very negative effects on watersheds too, and then you're back to flood and even mudslide and other potential unintended consequences around treatments on slopes and so on and so forth after fires. So it's complicated, all to say, but the controllable variables are different between the two, and both the regulatory models and the economic models for rising to those challenges are likely to be quite distinct. So I think you're on the right path there.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Sarah. And I think we're just about at the bottom of the clock here, so we may have to move along. Thank you very much from my side. I'm sure Chad will thank you as well, but thank you, Don and Tamsin, for these amazing presentations. Very informative, great discussion. It's always great to hear both of you speak, so thanks for making the time. And as mentioned before, if you join later, we will have a recording available for this session within a few days, hopefully, and we'll send it around to the group. But I'm going to pass it over to Chad, I think, for some remarks.
Really quickly, I too just want to extend my sincere thank you to Tamsin Lyle and Don Iveson for the fantastic presentations today. I wanted to recite a couple quick lines for you for people as we wrap up things. I like that point about the most expensive home is the one you need to rebuild after an extreme weather event. I've actually heard our ministers say that line as well. And key points there about OSFI and that required disclosure of risk. The lenders also heard, Tamsin, in your slide about we need maps that consider future hazard regulatory policies to limit development and financial policies to limit investment. So many key points across the complexity. Love it when we have a discussion that involves the words of physics, as well as conditioning federal funding, things that occupy some of us in our day jobs. Big thank you to our IBWG members for participating in the discussions. October 1st will be our next IBWG meeting of this group. And a summary note from today's call will be sent out along with pieces such as the book, Tamsin, you mentioned. We'll try to include all the links that people want to send us to and notes of upcoming events in that as one way of reaching out to people. We did mention earlier on, there's a directory of the folks involved with this call. We invite you to update that directory with your information so that can be facilitating our ongoing network with one another. I think that's very much it, unless there's any other final words. There's new messages always at the bottom. Somebody telling me I had a cat filter on. I hope not. I think we're going to call it a wrap. Thank you very much for everybody's participation today.